You can be taught something, but I think it's a secondary or tertiary pleasure of the first, which is to be immersed in some illuminated truth. And that's what I try to do in my scribblings, and it's hard as hell, frankly.
Can I ask you, because we've just about run out of time,
Yeah.
Andre, before we go to our next author, but I wanted to ask you, do you have some parting words that you would like to leave with students or aspiring authors?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay.
What I would tell aspiring young writers is what I would tell aspiring young actors or musicians or painters or dancers. You live in a culture that values what you do only after you get rich and famous. The rest of the time, I'm generalizing, what you do is looked at as a hobby, and you should give it up because you're not going to make any money at it.
Right.
I say forget that because we're all going to die. And I hope you all live 140 years. But even if you don't, you want to be alive now. And if writing poetry makes you feel more alive than any other time, then you should absolutely shape your life around writing poetry, whether you ever get published or known or not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I'd like to say. Life is short. Dive in. If you're lucky enough to have found a gift this young, just do it and shape your life around it. And frankly, I believe the old New Age bumper sticker anyway. I think if you do what you love, money will follow. I think it really does.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're here with Andre Dubus, John Ogden from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And thank you so much for coming on.
I enjoyed
This was great.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're going to be right back. If you love a good detective novel, you want to stay tuned. Thanks. Thanks for joining us again on Eye on You. I'm Bridget Driscoll, and I'm here today with UML student, Michelle Bradley.
Hello.
Michelle, I understand you are working at the school newspaper as
Yes.
editor-in-chief.
Yes.
And then can you tell us also what else you do for your job?
I work at the Boston Globe in the sports department. I'm a high school football reporter.
Awesome.
So
Great.
it keeps me out of
Thank you.
trouble.
So Michelle is going to be interviewing with us today. And then our special guest, we have Dr. Hillary Holliday from the University of Massachusetts Lowell from the English department. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Bridget.
Yeah. Well, aside from Hillary's new book that's come out, The Dreams of Mary Rolandinson, can you tell us about poems and poetry? I wanted to ask you, when did you start becoming, having this love for poetry?
Well, I think it goes back a long ways. Probably I was about 7 years old when I started writing poetry, and as a child, my mother was a writer, and so I picked that up from her, and I just have always loved language. And to me, poetry is a form of playing and having fun. So I think as a child, that's what drew me to it, that it was just fun to play with words, just the same way that it's fun to play with Play-Doh or play with, bouncing a ball. So it's the love of poetry, I think, has really been with me my whole life.
Mm-hmm. Michelle?
Great. Coming from a student's perspective, I was wondering, poetry, especially for myself, has been kind of a challenging subject. How do you keep students inspired or interested when they have a tendency to be hesitant about the subject?
Well, it can be a challenge to teach, I think, and a lot of students come into my classes and they may not have had the greatest experiences with poetry, say in high school, and I just like to start fresh. And I hope that when my students see that I truly love poetry and that it's made a difference in my life, that they'll think, well, it means something to her, so maybe it can mean something to me too. I don't think you can force poetry or any form of literature on people, and I would never attempt to do that. But I think it's a matter of feeling out an individual student, and eventually I can find a poet that anyone will like. And it might be a beat poet, it might be Allen Ginsberg, or it might be someone like Emily Dickinson. So I guess over time I've developed sort of a feel for what will go over well, whether it's with a group of older people or with a group of freshmen or with, upperclassmen English majors.
Getting back to your new book about the dreams of Mary Rolandinson, can you tell the audience, can you tell us a little bit the background about this and how you created this?
I sure can. I had first read Mary Rowlandson's own narrative of her being captured by Indians when I was in graduate school. And it struck me then as just a fascinating portrait of a woman's life. Mary Rowlandson was a Puritan woman living in Massachusetts, what was then the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And she was married to a Puritan minister living in the town of Lancaster, a very small rural town. And during King Philip's War, Indians came to that little village and attacked the town, and they kidnapped her and her children. They killed a lot of people in this little community. And so Mary Rowlandson, this was in 1676, went off with her Indian captors and traveled around New England for about 11 weeks. And she had an Indian master, and his wife was her mistress. And so she had these very difficult, trying experiences with these Indians, with her captors. And so in my collection, what I wanted to do, when I revisited her own account of her troubles a few years back, I thought, I wonder what that was really like. When she wrote her book, which came out in 1682, she wrote it from a very Christian perspective. Mm-hmm. And I find it fascinating and beautifully written, but I felt like there was more to the story than what she put on paper. And so I wanted to explore her emotional life. So I drew epigraphs from her book to start off most of my poems, and then I would use those as jumping off points for my explorations of what was going on for her emotionally. Mm-hmm. And so some of what I write is fictionalized. And as you know, some of the poems are from the Indian's perspective or from an omniscient perspective as well.
Right. Now, what were some of the challenges, and how long did this take you? I mean,
Well, what was interesting for me was I wrote it pretty quickly. I think because I had been thinking so intensely about Mary Rowlandson's life and her experiences. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say I was channeling her, but it was close to that. I felt very close to her. And so I wrote most of the poems over the space of several months, I guess, and then I knew that I needed some more to round out the collection, so I kept working at it. But as for the challenges, I guess I wanted to be true to her experience. I didn't want to depart from it so much that it would somehow make a mockery of what she had written. Mm-hmm. I have a great deal of respect for what she wrote and for the suffering she experienced. But I think these days especially we're so much more sensitive to what the Indians were going through at that time. And of course they ultimately lost. And so I wanted to be true to their experiences as well. And I think that was a challenge. And I wanted to also look at her whole family and imagine what it was like for her husband, who had not been captured, mm-hmm. and who was frantic to get his wife and his children back and felt some guilt that he wasn't at home in Lancaster at the time of the attack on his home in his mm-hmm. town.
Okay, so you mentioned this poetry, but is there any other poetry you find yourself very drawn to, or that you find very kind of at the top of your list?
In terms of what I like to read or write?
Yeah, what you like to read, maybe what you like to teach your students. I mean, you mentioned how you try to find a poet for each person. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. I'm currently teaching literature of the Beat movement, so I'm teaching Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and lots of other poets. And I find with the Beat writers that they're naturally accessible to students, and because they're rebellious and they have some political edge to them, students like that. And they don't write in the strict forms that we associate with high school poetry, you know, those neat little boxy poems. And so I find that a lot of people respond to those poets, and then they realize, well, poetry's not so bad after all. And it can be an act of personal rebellion or personal experience. And from there, often students will go on to read lots of other poets. So I think of the Beat Literature course as a sort of